right, everyone. Thanks everyone for joining. We are going to get started. It's nice to see so many folks in here and familiar names, not faces, but it's time. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us on the 2023 webinar, Data-Driven Strategic Messaging for BIPOC Communities Through Stories in the Public Square. I'm Sherilyn Seeley, and I'm the Senior Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts. So before we begin our webinar, just take a moment to review the Zoom features so that you have an optimal experience with us today. And if you have any questions for our tech team during the presentation, you can feel free to use the chat function and reach out to anyone who has LGC Tech at the beginning of their name, and they'll be able to help you. Otherwise, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions to our presenters, okay? And if you would like your experience to include live captioning, then you can select the closed caption option, or CC, and the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, and select show subtitle. Okay, so you can tell I'm so excited because I just keep skipping over what I'm saying. I'm like, the presentation's starting soon. So before we begin, we actually want to start off with a poll just to kind of get a sense of who's in the room and what you're thinking. What you're thinking is kind of coming into this presentation. So the question is, and I'll put it in the chat in a moment, is there a significant data point? We can go, oh, okay, yeah, is there a significant data point that you remember that has shifted the narrative that you've had about a population? So we all have different, ideas, thoughts, biases, narratives in our minds about particular groups of people or populations. Can you recall a time where there was one particular data point that you heard about this population that shifted the narrative in your mind? So go ahead and let us know in the chat, okay? And I'll keep introducing our webinar. So data has the power to persuade mindsets, behaviors, and funding. And the philanthropic sector turns to data to gain a better understanding of the needs of a community. However, what is the messaging, research, and media landscape? What has it been in the United States regarding Black, Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, Sikh, and South Asian communities? What happens when data is coupled with communication strategy that silences and erases the exact voices that should be centered in the narrative? What's the best way to develop an inclusive approach to studying specific and smaller populations to ensure the representation of voices that are usually unheard in public opinion research? So we're going to get into this conversation with some of our amazing presenters. So I'm going to list them now. We've got Firdaus Arastu, Program Director for Rights and Inclusion Team at Rethink Media. Aram Ikramullah, I might be mispronouncing, so please, Grace, the Research Program Manager at ISPU. Neil Ruiz, Head of New Research Initiatives and Associate Director of Race and Ethnicity Research at Pew Research Center. And Zeba Rahman, Director of the Building Bridges Program at Doris Duke Foundation. And we also have an extra special guest, Eva, Eva Galanis, right? Is that Galanes? Is that
it's Galanis Rosenbaum? No worries.
Wonderful. Thank you. We have an extra special guest, and she is here today. She's the Chief Operating Officer for Rethink Media. And so she'll be kind of coming in and out, especially once we get to the questions section of the webinar, and chiming in. She's done a lot of research that we're going to be hearing about today. So we're glad for this extra special surprise. And I am going to kick it over to Firdaus to get us started. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, thank you so much. I'll do a very quick intro for me, and then dive right into our agenda and talk a little bit about the research that Rethink has done. So my name is Firdaus. I'm a communication strategist. And so I work to shift media narratives of communities of color in the United States, particularly those impacted by racism and Islamophobia, which is an ongoing problem in the United States, and we use data to help guide our strategy. So in the Rights and Inclusion team, which I direct, we work to build the movement capacity and strategic communication skills of leading experts, creative professionals, and organizations from Black, Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, Sikh, and South Asian communities. I'm really excited to be able to present alongside Aram and Neil because we often work with them on the reaching these populations, as well as utilizing the research that they have been conducting over the past few decades to really ensure that the work that's being done in both creative and advocacy spaces is one that's moving the needle on issues and moving populations to a more favorable position. So I'll turn it over to Neil to introduce himself.
Hi, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Neil Ruiz.
You're muted, Neil. If you could unmute so that we can all hear you.
Oh, there we go.
Thank
Hi,
you.
everyone. My name is Neil Ruiz, Head of New Research Initiatives at Pew Research Center. I lead our Asian American work, as well as our new research initiatives at the center. And I really work a lot on really filling the gap of public opinion research. There's a lot of populations in America that haven't been heard, that a lot of people say is expensive or too hard to reach. And my job is really to say that we could fill that. Yep, I'll pass it back to Firdaus.
And then we'll have Aram introduce herself as a third speaker.
Thank you so much, Firdaus. I'm really excited to be here. I serve as Senior Research Project Manager at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Our mission is to provide objective research and education about American Muslims to support well-informed dialogue and decision-making. I'm really excited to share about two exciting projects we have going on, and I'll also tell you a little bit more about ISPU and our approach when we get to my slide deck. Thank you.
So in today's session, you can see that you are going to hear from folks who are nerds for data. At Rethink, we gather data because we use it to inform communication strategy. It is a means to an end. And we track public opinion through polling, as well as conducting our own research, which I'll share with you today. And really, in order for us to chart a path, we have to understand where we're starting from in order to know where we want to go. And we need to build cohesive messaging across organizations that work on the same issue so that we have a more powerful voice when we reach our audiences. So today we're going to walk through three sections together. First, we'll talk about who our audiences are and understanding them in more depth. So Neil and I will tag team on this part. And then we will talk about how we reach communities of color, not just talk about them. And I'll tag team with Aram on this section. And then in the third section around translating data into media and stories, we will hear from Neil and Aram about how they've taken their data and done storytelling projects around those. And then we'll wrap up by doing an open Q&A at the end for questions that you have across the data that we're all presenting. So in this first section around understanding audiences, as I mentioned, in order to be effective in creating change and moving people to behave differently, we have to first look at who our audiences are and what they're already carrying in their minds on the topic. And working backwards from who our audiences are and what they already believe to our intended goal of social change or media placement or ongoing advocacy work or even creating storytelling projects is when we understand that data, we can create a more focused strategy and ultimately be more successful. The data that I will be sharing today comes from Rethink Media's messaging and public opinion research, which we conducted in 2016 and then conducted again in 2021. So I'll be sharing data from both of those sets. So this bell curve you see in front of you is what we often use to depict for folks of how typical messaging research breaks the public into generally three buckets, but here we like to nuance a little bit further into five. And so usually we see the left-hand side of the curve is the base. These are people who are supportive of the issue. Then we have the persuadable middle, which is the majority of folks on any given issue, be it mint chocolate chip is your favorite flavor of ice cream, or we're talking about surveillance of Muslim communities. This bell curve generally can describe how audiences fall along an issue. And then on the right side, we see the opposition. And that dotted line that's sort of faint that you see in the middle is the 50% mark. And anybody who's worked on a campaign knows that you have to reach at least 51% right in order to be able to move towards victory. So successful messaging is one that activates or strengthens the resolve of the base, the folks in green, reaches out to the persuadables to move them to the base, and pushes away the opposition, marginalizes the opposition's views so that we can shore up our base and our persuadables. So I want to break down for you what those audiences look like when it comes to BAMEMSSA communities. And BAMEMSSA is the acronym we use for Black, Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, Sikh, and South Asian folks in the United States. So here I will show you what that bell curve looks like for those audiences in terms of building or racial justice and civil rights for those communities. So the choir are people who have truly integrated support for BAMEMSSA folks into other political and social views. So, the folks that you would imagine for this are, activists who are already involved, people who volunteer for an advocacy organization. Then we have our base, people whose views otherwise align with support for our positions, but who still harbor some reservations or unresolved biases towards Muslims and Islam. Then we have our persuadable middle. These are people who are still squidgy, as we talk about it at Rethink, who could be tipped toward or against us. They're on the fence. But we have to remember that they're also being courted by the opposition and the opposition's messaging. Then we move to the right-hand side of the bell curve that I showed you, people who are in the opposition. These are people who may never fully support BAMEMSSA communities, but who are not actively or openly spreading hateful policies or views. And then finally, we have the unreachables, people who are bigoted, engaged in hate speech, or supportive of Islamophobic policies. So some of these folks are elected officials who espouse this sentiment and speak it into the media. And these are the folks who we are tussling with in terms of the persuadable who is being courted by them as well. So I want to give you some actual numbers around the characteristics of each of these three buckets: the base, the persuadable, and the opposition. So the base, people who have favorable opinions of BAMEMSSA communities, tend to be Democrats and people of color. They tend to know a Muslim personally, and they tend to be on the younger side. These are folks who are Gen Z, early millennials, and many of them identify as non-religious. Then we have our persuadable middle, and the political affiliation of these folks tends to mirror the general American population. 2/3 of them identify as white, and we see about half of them know a Muslim. And then finally, in the opposition tends to be Republican, tends to mostly be white, and they tend to not know a Muslim personally and are on the older end of the 50 to 64-year-old range and identify mostly as Christian. So I want to, in this next section, show you a little bit about what our audiences think about, and crucially, how do they think about September 11th, which of course was a very important moment in shifting how people viewed Muslims and BAMEMSSA communities in the United States. So when we look at how 9/11 is perceived, we see that in 2016, 15 years after September 11th, that this was still the number one historic event that had occurred in people's lifetime that had from their own perception, that had the greatest impact on the country, 76% of folks. And so this is of the general population, as you can see, survey of US adults conducted in the summer of 2016. And so even for folks who are from different generations, from the baby boomer generation, from Gen Xers, who had other events that were very significant historically, September 11th still was the number one named event. When we look a little bit later in 2021, September 11th is a powerful memory for Americans, but for those who were alive or old enough to remember what happened. And so we start to see that for Gen Z folks, things look very different because some of them were not even born when September 11th happened. And even if they were, that was something that they would have come to learn about as a historic event or reading about in textbooks or hearing secondhand. So you can see from this data that of the events that they were asked to respond to, September 11th falls fifth in that period in terms of the historical events that had a major impact on their worldview. A couple of other sort of challenges to consider around what's happening in the minds of our audience is, in our research at Rethink, we asked people in the survey, how well does the statement that Muslims, quote, do not treat women with respect match your viewpoint? Now, this is the number one hurdle that we have to work on in terms of our messaging and encountering audiences, is the perception that Islam is inherently misogynistic. And you can see that the persuadables are extremely high in saying this is something that that matches their viewpoint. And even in the sample, it's falling close to 50%. Now, in this graph, we often get this question is, we broke out all the respondents who identified as African American and all the respondents who identified as Hispanic, so that we could see how those communities of color match up sort of with the overall base and the overall persuadables. Happy to answer more about that in the Q&A. The second major hurdle is the perception that Muslims are too prone to violence. You can see that this is still a strong perception amongst both the base and the persuadable. But as I flip back, you can see not quite as high as the perception around misogyny. Now, we know that patriarchy and misogyny exist in pretty much every culture around the world, but there is a perception that somehow Muslims and Islam are somewhat uniquely misogynistic. And then the last couple of things I want to share around audiences is that when we look at the opposition, you can boil down their messaging to these 4 words: that it is better to be safe than sorry. This is the underlying sentiment across all of the messaging that comes from them around Islamophobic views, anti-Muslim sentiment against BAMEMSSA communities. And it is a very emotionally powerful message that has allowed for many of the policies that harm and criminalize communities in the United States. And this data point the last point that I want to make around audiences is that internalized Islamophobia is rising amongst Muslims. This data comes from our colleagues at ISPU, and it is a deeply disturbing trend. And you can see that in 2019, when ISPU did this research, that Muslims on the Islamophobia index, and Ira might be able to speak to this more if you have more questions around this. Sorry, Ira, I'm voluntolding you. Is that about 14% of Muslims, when they were surveyed, had scored some level on the Islamophobic index. When we look at that data 3 years later, you can see now that that number has jumped to 26%, so more than a quarter, and is higher now than the general population. So we're seeing that this is a problem that needs to be addressed when it comes to our messaging, when it comes to reaching our audiences, for shoring up our base, as I talked about earlier. I see a question in the chat. Can you share the full acronym of BAMEMSSA? Yes, Black, Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, Sikh, and South Asian. I will drop that into the chat in just a moment. I will pause here and turn it over to my colleague Neil to talk more about AAPI communities and the research that Pew did.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. And now I'm going to turn into work on Asian Americans. This is a multi-year project that has been leading at Pew Research Center, that has a set of focus groups, a survey, as well as post-survey focus groups. In these slides, I'm going to talk about the focus groups. First off, we think of, there are actually several challenges. Asian Americans are 7% of the US population, about 24 million Asian Americans, but they're very diverse, right? So if you think about the Asian continent, people immigrating from Asia, every country is very different, right? Different cultures, different languages, different ways of life, and also different waves of people who immigrated from different places to the US. And also, because it's a smaller population compared to the general population, it becomes expensive to survey. So first off, when we typically see surveys on Asian adults in the US, and this is we typically only have surveys that are conducted in English. So And this is something that we've done at Pew Research Center, but we're pretty clear about what we do. But it's really important to do sometimes deeper dive surveys, as well as other deeper studies to understand in multiple languages. So when we look at the slide is a little different here. Asian Americans in general, there are 6 groups. There are Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Filipino, and Japanese that make up 85% of the US Asian population. But there are populations that are much smaller, such as Pakistani, Thai, Burmese, Indonesian, Mongolian, Bhutanese, that are 2% or less of the 24 million Asian Americans in the United States. And also, when you look at the diversity within these origins, you notice there's different economic circumstances that reflect different ways origin groups have come to the US. For instance, Indian Americans have very high income because many have been entering the US as H-1B or foreign students into the US. Whereas other groups like Burmese, Nepalese, Lao, Hmong entered the US more as refugees or those who are living in conflict. So having a very different starting point in the United States as reflected here in household income. Also, language, it matters. So if we look at some groups have a higher English proficiency, but a lot of the other groups like Burmese, Bhutanese, Vietnamese, Hmong have much lower English proficiency. So if you do any surveys only in English, you're really going to be excluding them. So how did we include all these different diverse circumstances and different voices? At Pew Research Center, we had to go beyond surveys because we know it would be really challenging to try to report every single group for Thai, Vietnamese, Pakistani in a survey. So we did 66 focus groups in 2021 of 18 different Asian origin groups in 18 different languages, all moderated by members of their ethnic groups. This was really important for us to do this work because we wanted to hear their voices and their stories. We broke up these focus groups. They were conducted all virtually because it was in the middle of the pandemic, but they were nationally recruited from around the United States. And we broke them up into those by household income, as well as those who were born abroad, as well as born in the United States. And a lot of these findings you can see in the chat. You could read more about the findings and the data essay that we published on these focus groups. But here's just also a look. It accompanied with a documentary to hear, and sometimes when you do qualitative work, it's hard to capture. Usually in quantitative work or surveys, you have a chart that kind of captures the main findings. We wanted to really capture the qualitative findings. So we had to hear the stories from people who are similar to the focus group. So here's some of the videos that you see here, as well as in the chat among people who've been recruited similarly to our focus groups. So we had stories of those who lived during Japanese incarceration, people who immigrated, who are from Laos, who immigrated as refugees. Some people, as you can see here, from Pakistan as well, talking about his experience from September 11th onwards. And so all these diverse stories are all in this documentary and short videos. So now I'll pass it back to Firdaus.
Thank you, Neil. So in this section, we're going to talk about how we reach communities of color. And as I said, reach them, not just talk about them. Often research is about the demographics, but doesn't take into account, well, how do we, as I mentioned, if we want to reach our base, and we saw most of them are communities of color, what are they thinking about? What is an effective way to reach them? What's going on? So I'm going to start by talking about the 2021 research that we conducted. So how do we talk about the BAMEMSSA communities in the media? Literally, how do we refer to them? So in this graph that I'm going to pull up, we asked the question, is around ending the surveillance and profiling of, and then gave people these different options of how to describe the BAMEMSSA communities. And the term at the top was the one that received the most favorability, Black and Brown people. Now we have to remember the time period in which this was conducted, right? This is after the racial reckoning of 2020. And so this was terminology that people were already hearing and was encompassing of many communities of color in the United States. And you can see as we look through this graph that as we start changing that up a little bit. Even when we change Black and brown to describing in more detail Muslim, Arab, Black, and South Asian people, that number drops, that green bar drops quite significantly. And it continues to drop as we name different communities. Now, I'll just note here that what I'm saying here is not to not use those terms. What I'm saying is, where do we start when we talk about BAMEMSSA communities in the media? And it is good to start with a term that is a bigger umbrella that has favorability, and then to use more specific terms to describe who is actually being impacted and affected. In this next one, I'm going to show you, when we look at that data in a little bit more detail around those different elements of the bell curve, how do we talk about BAMEMSSA communities to the base? So to folks who mostly identify as Democrats, who are mostly younger, who are people of color themselves, we see that it pretty much stays the same, that Black and brown people still is the term that is most favorable to our audiences. And that number starts to decrease as we work our way down to these other terms that many of our advocates have used in various media engagements. And you can see here actually on this chart that Muslim, Arab, Black, and South Asian, of the ones that is listed, is the one that received, sorry, I misquoted. The term at the end, Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian, is the term that received the least favorability amongst the base. Next, how do we talk about BAMEMSSA communities to the persuadables, the majority of folks that we are trying to reach who have not yet made up their mind? And we can see here the data is showing a little bit more of those red bars. Again, the term Black and brown is still the term that is the best one to use when starting to talk about how policies have impacted these communities, what current situations are happening. And building in some of these other terms as you go, depending on who specifically your audience is, and ensuring that they have some familiarity before we name other populations that are affected. And then I want to talk specifically about, how do you talk about BAMEMSSA communities to communities of color themselves? So this graph looks a little bit different visually. And so you want to work your way from the bottom up. And the blue bars are the ones that break out respondents of color versus white respondents. And you can see that for communities of color, POC audiences, Black and brown is the term that resonates for us, as well as talking about us to other people. And then the other terms sort of go down the gradation. And sadly and unsurprisingly, as I see as someone who identifies as Muslim herself, that just talking about Muslims is not enough to reach folks. You can see that number drops from about 85-ish down to about just a little over 50. These numbers are not surprising to those of us who work in this field. And while it is dismaying, it points to how just shifting around a few terms can invite more people into the conversation. Oh, flipped ahead a little too quickly. I want to also bring in some data from some of our partner groups in the field to give you a little bit more around some of the BAMEMSSA communities that we work with. So I want to share some data around Arab Americans as a specific population amongst BAMEMSSA communities. So the data I'm going to share with you here is from the 2020 poll that Arab American Institute conducted. And Arab Americans are a very diverse community of immigrants and descendants of immigrants in the United States, numbering about 3.7 million. And when Arab Americans were asked how they most likely define themselves, is it by country of origin, is it by religion, or is it using the term Arab American? Almost 30% of them preferred the term Arab American over country of origin, which fell around 27%, and religion, which was at 15%. And more than 75% of Arab Americans who responded to this survey said that they were very proud of their ethnic heritage. And this is despite the fact that 61% of them claim that they have personally experienced discrimination because of their ethnicity or country of origin. If you want those numbers written down, I'm happy to share them again in the chat. And I also wanted to bring in some data from our colleagues at Pew around Black Muslims and their experience in the United States. And so you can see from these data, most Black Muslims say there is a lot of discrimination against Black folks and against Muslims in the United States. And you can see how that breaks down differently for Black folks who identify as Muslim versus Black folks who identify as Christian. And in terms of understanding, what is the population of Black Muslims in the United States? In 2021, an estimated 47.2 million people in the United States identified as Black, and just 2% of Black Americans are Muslim. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Iram to talk about the research that she is conducting and the ISPU is conducting.
Thank you so much, Firdaus. And I'd like to just start with a little bit of more information about the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding for those who may not be familiar. As I mentioned in my introduction, our mission is to provide objective research and education about American Muslims to support well-informed dialogue and decision-making. And we work towards this mission using a three-pronged approach, which is to discover, educate, and equip. So first, we discover new facts by conducting original rigorous research. Then we take those insights and educate the general public through presentations, social media campaigns, and media engagements. And then we also equip those in positions to make change with our research. Some of these change makers include journalists, funders, policymakers, educators, artists, and more. And so our theory of change is that if ISPU provides unique data analysis and recommendations on community development and domestic policy issues that impact American Muslim communities, then advocates and others kind of doing that work on the ground can use this data to inform their work and act upon the research. As we like to say at ISPU, facts fuel progress, facts fuel change. So today I'll be sharing findings from two projects currently funded by the Building Bridges program. The first is a project we like to call NAMES, which stands for Native American and Indigenous Muslim Stories. And the second is a project looking at Latino views of Muslims. I'd like to add that part one of the NAMES project was published last year. And that part two will be published in November. I think there should be a link dropped in the chat soon for the part one, which was called Visions and Voices. And I'll be referencing that later in my presentation. And then the Latino Views project, that report, we're excited to be releasing it coming soon in October. I'm really excited to be able to share a sneak peek of the findings with you all today. So this pie chart shows the racial ethnic breakdown of American Muslims based on ISPU's 2019 American Muslim poll, which is a nationally representative poll of American Muslims as well as Americans of different faiths and no faith. So based on this graph, a new larger project was initiated by the Doris Duke Foundation in partnership with ISPU. Specifically, that yellow sliver you see in the pie chart that shows that 2% of American Muslims in 2019 identify as Native American or Indigenous. The goal of the NAMES project is to shine light on this little known community, which is at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities. There's definitely an absence of awareness and lack of representation of Native American and Indigenous Muslims, both in the broader US context, as well as within the US Muslim community. And the expected impact is to increase awareness of this overlooked community, drive strategic resource allocation, provide accurate portrayals for media and education. Oops, sorry, I think I clicked ahead. Okay. Sorry, there's a lot on this slide. We're going to be here for a minute. But I'd like to, this is sort of a sneak peek into what we'll be publishing this November. So in the NAMES study, we employed qualitative methods, specifically one-on-one interviews with Native Americans who identify as Muslim, as well as focus groups with Native Americans who are not Muslims. So in 2022, we published Visions and Voices. And then this November, we're publishing what I'll be sharing now, which is a thematic analysis of this qualitative data. The interview, so in terms of themes we found in our interviews with Native American Muslims, there were kind of 4 overarching themes. So the first was Muslim and Native identity. And, you know, I'll mention the themes and then like a really quick discussion of it. So for that first theme, Muslims and Native identity, our interview participants included both converts to Islam as well as those born into the faith. And for those who converted to Islam, the circumstances which drew them to the religion are very much consistent with other research on American converts to Islam overall, which, you know, found certain drivers that led to conversion, including proximity to Muslim communities, knowledge, access through the internet, and reading the Quran for themselves. And then several participants spoke about navigating their Native, Muslim, and other identities in diverse ways. They found ways to pull from their Native identity to help negotiate their different identities based on situations they encountered. A few research participants did speak about the struggle between their Native and Muslim identity. They expressed concerns about balancing both identities while at the same time commenting on how each sort of informed the other. But, you know, what we found overall is that the participants discussed at length the harmony between their Native culture and Islam. Overwhelmingly, they found that Islam and their Native cultures were not only compatible, but actually, you know, had similar principles and values. Another important theme that emerged was around solidarity between Palestinians, 93% of whom are Muslims, and Native peoples, based on like a shared experience of including displacement, colonization, and oppression with both groups have encountered at the hands of colonial powers. And many participants wish Native people and the broader Muslim community understood their complexities and that Native and Muslim are not mutually exclusive categories and that Native Muslims do exist. It was essentially what we heard is that this desire to be seen. They expressed a desire for both communities to learn more about each other and to challenge common stereotypes. Turning now to the themes that emerged in the focus groups with Native Americans who are not Muslim, there were, again, 4 overarching themes. Those were encountering Native American Muslims, understanding of Islam, commonalities and differences, and understanding that Islamophobia is a pervasive problem. We found that most participants actually had never met someone who was Native American and Muslim, but they were somewhat familiar with Islam, and this kind of got us into this understanding of Islam. When discussing Islam, participants brought up negative media portrayals of Islam, Muslims, and they brought up Middle East conflicts as well. And despite media driving negative and stereotypical conversations about Muslims and Islam, the majority of participants shared, you know, an understanding of the media's role in these portrayals and the importance of not basing their own views on these portrayals, but rather on interaction with people. And so that, you know, what that kind of the conclusion was that many expressed interest in interacting and learning more about Islam and Muslims through speaking with other people and getting to know Muslims. Many participants also acknowledged common struggles between the two groups, specifically in terms of advocating and fighting for the right to practice their religion freely. And there was a call for decolonization and unifying as a community while respecting each other's differences. And so based on, you know, the themes that I very quickly discussed, and I hope you all have an opportunity to read through when the report is out, We offer several recommendations, which are to complete additional research to build out a more complete picture. As we mentioned, this is sort of a very one-of-a-kind, groundbreaking study, and there's, you know, once you finish one study, you realize more areas to research. Another recommendation is to create community gatherings to bring people together. We also recommend that Muslims should intentionally engage and learn about Native Americans. We also recommend using creative programs to help build understanding. And then finally, education is key for everyone. I'll turn now to the other project looking at Latino views of Islam and Muslims. Again, a new research project sort of grounded and sort of conceptualized based on a quantitative data point. So again, in our 2019 American Muslim poll, we found that Latinos had relatively lower levels of Islamophobia than other groups that, and that's again using the Islamophobia index that Firdaus mentioned and referenced earlier. And also, as shown on the slide here, we found that Latinos were more likely to know Muslims than white Americans, and were also more likely to have a close friend who was Muslim. Sorry, the chart on the screen is showing the percent who hold favorable versus unfavorable views. And again, here we show that Latinos are more likely than others to hold favorable views of Muslims. And so when we came across this finding, sorry, let me advance this slide. Okay. So the goal was to understand why why, you know, why is there this difference between why do Latinos hold relatively lower levels of Islamophobia? And it's important because Latino Americans represent a substantial portion of the US population, and they appear to be less susceptible to the influence of the Islamophobia industry. So our goal was to understand how and why Latino Americans have relatively lower levels of Islamophobia, and to then use, and again, as you know, was mentioned at the beginning, the idea is always to have like the research is a means to an end, right? So our end goal is to employ insights that we learn from this research to education and outreach efforts to counter Islamophobia. And so with this study, we're taking a positive deviance approach where we're studying something that seems to be working well and trying to learn more and see how we can apply it to other communities or other outreach work. And so for this study was also, we worked on qualitative data collection where we conducted focus group with Latinos who are not Muslim. And we asked them about their views around Muslims and Islam. And there were sort of 4 overarching themes that related to lower levels of Islamophobia among Latinos. So the first theme is a perception that both groups have similar experiences with discrimination in the US. So again, this idea of solidarity around like a shared experience in terms of rights. So participants saw commonality between Latinos and Muslims in the form of experiencing negative media portrayals of their communities. And similarly, a commonality around partaking in the immigrant experience and the American dream. Typically, this connection was framed by drawing on the idea of the American dream and its themes, including a shared desire for liberty and freedom, financial stability, and the opportunity to make a better life for oneself and one's family. The third theme was everyday interactions with American Muslims. We found that Latinos perceive common immigrant experience and everyday interactions with American Muslims based more on cultural and social interactions and less so, and really not at all, on political factors. They weren't really they didn't come up at all in our focus groups. And then we also found that some of our participants sort of brought up this idea of commonality across religions. Our research found that interactions with American Muslims and people of different backgrounds was an important factor that led Latinos to express positive views. This idea people being committed to their faith and holding onto their values. At the same time, we did find that despite relatively lower levels of Islamophobia compared with other groups, it wasn't zero. And we found some level of Islamophobia does persist among Latinos. And the most salient form of Islamophobia is a view of perceived misogyny inherent to Islam. And again, this is very much in line with what Firdaus presented earlier, and what some of our other research at ISPU shows is that on that Islamophobia index, it is this stereotype of Islam being inherently misogynistic, which resonates the most kind of across the board among the general public. So the themes we found related to this were this idea of perceived misogyny, media stereotypes of Muslims as violent, and religion as a point of difference. So whereas some people saw religion as a point of commonality, it also emerged as a point of difference. Just want to see if there was anything else to add there. One thing around the misogyny is that we often found that participants kind of express the sentiment by referring to treatment of women outside of the US and then sort of projecting it on American Muslims. At the same time, some participants did also bring up direct references to the treatment of American Muslim women. And then in terms of media stereotypes as Muslims as violent, we did a word association exercise in our focus groups where we asked our participants what they believe the average American thinks of when they hear the word Muslim. And, the things that came up were violence, extremism, terrorism. Those are the main things that came up. And then in terms of religion as a point of difference, it relates a lot back to that first point around perceived misogyny. Specifically, there was a view that Islam is a patriarchal religion in which women lack autonomy. In the focus groups, we asked participants whether Catholic Latinas who wear a veil, is that similar to Muslim women wearing a hijab? Is that a similar kind of cultural or religious meaning? And some participants expressed that both might be seen as a display of respect or reverence. Many viewed them as different. So finally, we kind of end with some recommendations based on a few things that we were able to do in our focus groups. One was that we showed a short video about the pillars of Islam, the 5 pillars of Islam. And we found that after watching this video, participants were more likely to perceive Islam as a religion similar to Christianity and Judaism, including, drawing connections between Ramadan and Lent, religious fasting, and believing in a higher being. And then after we saw how salient this theme of perceived misogyny was, we decided to actually organize an additional focus group than what we had planned, in which we would have all Latina women. And we wanted to further kind of examine these attitudes. And so participants in the final focus group were also shown a second video clip about why Muslim women choose to wear hijab. And we found that Latinas were more likely to reduce their negative attitudes about Muslim women and American Muslims when they were provided with information that brought them to kind of reconsider their beliefs. And then that final focus group also ended with we had a Latina Muslim who was serving as an advisor on our project join and share her own personal experience and perspective as a Latina Muslim, and to be able to answer questions. And we found that this was really beneficial and really appreciated by the participants. And so overall, we found that our research suggests that many Latinos don't quite have crystallized attitudes about American Muslims, and that interventions, like educational videos and personal interactions, can really help to build stronger bonds between these communities. I'll pass it back to Firdaus.
Thank you so much, Aram. I'm going to tee off the last section where we talk about translating data into media, into storytelling, and then we'll hear both from Aram and Neil about how they've taken the data sets that they're working on and done more than just produce a report and what that has meant in terms of the reception. So as somebody who works in comms and does comms strategy, I want to share a couple of principles and underlying themes. So when you're thinking about the audiences you're trying to message to, you have to understand what their values are, what do they care about. And so we've heard from both Neil and Aram and myself about the BAMEMSSA communities, Latinos, Indigenous Muslims, AAPI folks. What is it that folks from these communities care about, for instance? Or if you're messaging to persuadables, what is it that they already care about? And crucially, what is it that they're afraid of? Because our opposition plays on fear to reach audiences and to suggest solutions to that fear. So we have to find a way to connect with them based on the value that our audience shares, not about the value that we think is most important. So an effective message is one that is in that sweet spot in that Venn diagram between an expert, a spokesperson, a messenger, and the audience that they're trying to reach, and an overlap in their values that is actually authentic, which is the second piece I'll talk about. So a messenger has to believably, incredibly deliver a message that overlaps in order for it to be effective. So in this next slide, authentic and effective. When it's just one or the other, then things function a little bit differently. A message that is effective and inauthentic is often what we think about with a politician who's too scripted, that they say whatever that needs to be said in order to gain a vote. And people can smell that something is off when it is not real. The flip side is when a message is authentic, but not strategic. I describe that as screaming into the void. Like you say whatever you want, it's not really about who is listening. It's about you wanting to express whatever you feel. If you want to actually persuade people, you have to find a way to connect with your audience in an authentic way and understand all of this data that we're sharing in order to be able to do that. So I want to leave you with that sort of underlying thought when we listen to both Aram and Neil talk about how are they taking data in order to effectively engage with folks. So I believe Neil will speak first on AAPI stories.
Yeah, so I'll talk quickly about a case study. So there is a stereotype out there that Asian Americans are perpetual foreigners. We heard this in a lot of our focus groups. So what we decided to do in our survey, which we conducted in 2022-23, which is the largest survey of Asian Americans, where we sent out 268,000 invitations all around the country that yielded a sample size of 7,006, conducted in multiple languages, and fielded in a long period of time, over 6 months. But what we found here is that in our focus groups, people talked about this perpetual foreigner stereotype, where people kept asking them, where are you from? Where do you come here from? Assuming that you're not American, right? So we tested this data in our survey, and we found that Asian Americans on the left column compared to the general US population on values of what it means to be truly American. And Asian Americans are practically identical with the general population on believing, accepting diverse racial backgrounds, believing in individual freedoms, respecting US political institutions and laws. In their views on the American dream are practically identical in terms of having freedom of choice to live one's life, having a good family life, retiring comfortably. And when it came to their home countries, places where they came from, because there's an idea, because Asian Americans are largely immigrant population, that people have an idea that are they loyal here in the US or they're not? And we've seen this in terms of what's happening, especially geopolitics now, especially with China. And what we found is that Asian Americans actually have favorable views of the US, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And if you can see there in the bottom is China. And we are able to dig even deeper. Looking by origin group, we notice that Taiwanese Americans have, of course, a very favorable view of Taiwan, Japanese Americans towards Japan, South Koreans towards South Korea, but Chinese Americans were the exception. There was no majority of Chinese Americans that had a favorable view of China. What was interesting here is that Chinese Americans, this is a group that we hear all the time and thinking that they're loyal to China, see US, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea more favorably. And to dig deeper, this is actually interesting, has been in the media a lot now all around the world and in the United States, converse among a lot of Chinese diaspora, is about, Chinese American views of China and Taiwan differ. So it's much more majority on Taiwan favorability versus on China. So I will leave you there on those data points, but just to leave you there, that the data point can be important in terms of dispelling kind of stereotypes and hearing from the actual population, so they could really understand, rather than having a stereotype about being perpetual foreigners. Now we have data to show that Asian Americans are actually practically American, are identical to Americans, and they also have very similar views in foreign policy.
Thank you so much, Neil. So I'll spend a few moments sharing how the research I presented earlier will be used to educate the general public and equip change makers as part of ISPU's sort of three-pronged approach. For the Names Project in part one, the project we released last October, which was Visions and Voices, we created the interactive webpage, which is Visions and Voices. So this webpage allows users to view beautiful digital portraits of our participants, like the one here on this slide, and also to listen to audio snippets of interviews with the participants. And again, it's taking us back to our original intent with the project, which is to shed light on this community making up 2% of American Muslims, and American Muslims make up 1% of the US. So it's like 2% of the 1%. And what better way to shine light than to amplify participants' own voices and put faces to that 2% statistic and allow people to be seen and heard. As we prepare to release the thematic analysis this November, we will definitely be incorporating the visions and voices into our dissemination. Again, sort of this melding of research and arts, in terms of stories and narratives and portraits. One way we will do this is by inviting participants themselves to speak at dissemination events, both online and in person. Additionally, we are creating a set of printed portraits, which we hope will be exhibited at our dissemination events, as well as at museums, libraries, classrooms across the country. And we're hoping to actually have a downloadable set available for institutions and organizations who might want to print them out and host their own exhibit. Finally, the visions and voices and thematic analysis will be weaved into ISPU's sort of larger body of work, building understanding of American Muslims. So this means that these stories, these portraits will be included in various presentations, meetings, and trainings that ISPU organizes, not just those, specific to this project. And then turning to the Latino Views project, again, which we plan to release in October, what I'd like to highlight for this project is how data and research fuel on-the-ground community work. So I mentioned how the impetus for this project was based on, for this project of qualitative research, was based on a quantitative finding. And as we took on this project, we understood the importance of having a strong partner grounded in the Latino Muslim community. And so based on this, we partnered with Islam in Spanish for this project. Islam in Spanish is an organization with a mission to inspire, lead, and pioneer solutions in educating Latinos and others about Islam through media production and grassroots outreach worldwide. And in fact, some of the video snippet I mentioned about the pillars of Islam was produced by Islam in Spanish. And so for Islam and Spanish, this research, both quantitative and qualitative, can inform and strengthen their educational and outreach work by providing an evidence base. And then for us at ISPU, this community partnerships are essential for ensuring that our research questions and our approaches are grounded in community experiences. Essentially, we're forming a life cycle of research to community engagement and impact. I think I'll turn it back to Firdaus, I think, at this point.
Yeah, and I want to wrap up our formal presentation portion with this concluding thought, which is a quote from Drew Weston and his book, The Political Brain. And the quote is, "We do not find policies worth debating if they don't touch on the emotional implications for ourselves, our families, or things we hold dear." So while we are all very much in favor of creating data and producing data and investigating data, the data has to eventually move into a place of emotional consequence for our audiences, for them to actually sit with it. It's very difficult for us to recall statistics, but it is our brains are literally designed to incorporate and share stories. And so the work that Iram and Neil are doing around the storytelling portion is enormously useful in creating change in these communities. So with that, I believe we're going to open it up to Q&A with Zeba coming in with a couple of thoughts.
Thank you, Firdaus. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Iram. What a great session. You've really left us with so much rich and evidence-based data that we have a lot to draw on. And what I'd like to do at this point is put out a call to action to all my funder colleagues from the Building Bridges program here at the Doris Duke Foundation to say, let's work together to really start now to embed our narratives, both internal within our philanthropic practice and externally to public-facing constituents, and build in these nuances so that we can help to really influence the narrative that is really poisoning our society, and to create a community and an accurate depiction, not just of US-based Muslims, but also all the communities in the Black and Brown canvas of our society. So this is something we can do together. We can do it immediately. We can reference these great research studies that both Pew and ISPU have undertaken, and we can make it our practice. So that's the main thing, is to really start to practice embedding these facts and recommendations into our conversations. And I want to really thank Firdaus. You coined this term that you are nerds for data. Well, you're very, very important to us, especially those of us who are in the arts space and culture space, by giving us the very specific data to start with. I'll stop there and I'll hand it off to all of you to take it forward.
This is great. Thank you so much for that, Zeba, and that really strong call to action. Actually, before we go into our Q&A, I would just like to pose a question to all of you who are here presenting. And Eva, if you're hearing me, you can feel free to jump in on this as well. So why does funding research on underrepresented communities matter for broader work? And you can all take some time to just share your perspectives on why, kind of bringing in the funder lens, but also beyond that.
Yeah, I guess I'll start. I think there's a lot, like I said in my presentation, there's a lot of stereotypes out there about populations, especially the small populations that we normally don't hear in public opinion research. So the stereotypes become real. So what you showed in our research, we've used focus groups. We found out a stereotype that's been hurting them. We tested it out with data showing the values are practically, it's dispelled that truth, that stereotype. So that's why I think it's important that we hear from the actual population rather than letting a stereotype take hold as truth, in fact.
Great, thanks for that, Neil.
I'll jump in here if that's okay. I guess from my end, what I would add is that, having as a research organization and ISP, we focus on many different topics, but our sample of interest is all American Muslims within the broader US context. But the funding we receive, the work it allows us to do is just amazing because you don't see it being done anywhere else. We're as I mentioned, we're 1% of the US population. So you don't see larger, like the census, for example, there's no breakdowns by Muslim, which, for certain reasons, but you don't see a lot of other research organizations doing the very specific work like that we are doing at ISPU. And so it's only through these grants and foundations that we're able to do this work and not get sort of brushed under the rug and be able to produce the data and research that drives so much work on the ground. As we said, like, we're nerds for data, but it's a means to an end. And so by supporting the research, you're essentially supporting that end.
I will chime in as a comm strategist and say 3 different things, which is, one, I believe that funding research on underrepresented communities is an ethical responsibility, not just a realistic one in terms of the United States' population in the coming 25 to 50 years, in which the majority of people will be people of color. So it is like important realistically to understand what our community will be, but also it is just ethical. And also I believe it's a manifestation of our values. If we care about supporting communities of color, we should invest in understanding who they are, what they believe in, and what is it that they want. And I trained as an anthropologist, so my understanding of objectivity and qualitative research is very much coming from that perspective. And so this idea of like how proximate the people are who do the research to the communities that they study is one I think that is changing, and Iram and Neil can comment on this. But I believe that the proximity actually creates more credibility and creates better research when the people who are doing the investigation are ones who intimately understand that population rather than less. And this obviously shows up on the media side as well, is that the journalists who do the best reporting on, for instance, Muslim communities are Muslims themselves, because they understand how the stories have an impact, as well as have the proximity to really engage in those stories in a sensitive and nuanced way. So I think the work that, for instance, like Neil is doing, that Iram is doing, is these are communities that they are proximate to, and therefore the work that comes out of there is very rigorous and stellar.
Fantastic. Zeba, did you want to add anything else?
I really love the way all 3 of you answered this question, and I want to pick up on what Firdaus said just now, which is that intimate understanding is really needed to create, and I would say to create resonant stories across communities. And for that, one thing that we really need to support as funders are the updates of existing studies. Firdaus quoted from a study that was updated a couple of years ago. I know that Neil has a study that is being worked on in another department on US Muslims. Iram can certainly speak to studies that need updating. So there's the work of groundbreaking studies, which our researchers are already doing. And then there's the work of keeping that data current. And that very often gets left behind. So we really do need support for that. And I'll stop there. Those are my 2 cents worth. I know that Suzanne Callahan had a question.
Yeah, sure. Right before we get to, yeah, absolutely. I see these questions coming in. Keep the questions coming into the Q&A. Before we transition in, I do want to just note some of the things that you said really made me think of, you might be familiar with Chimamanda Ngozi. She's an author speaker, amazing person, queen, everything. She's great. And she spoke, one of her TED Talks was entitled The Danger of a Single Story. And she talks about when you only hear one person's story, or, you know, in this case, you see one individual data point or one perspective, or you learn about a particular stereotype that might be true for one person, but it's not necessarily like what's true for an entire population. And I think a lot of like what you said, it's so important to have updated data to get a little bit more proximity to groups and populations. And that also speaks to why having a token insert BIPOC community here, like, yes, inclusivity is great, but you only have one particular perspective. You don't understand fully a population group of people and how there are so many differences, and how like there's a lot of similarities and so many differences that I think people just don't really recognize and acknowledge. So I appreciate you all taking some time to kind of reflect on that together as we bring the presentation portion to a close. And so now we're going into our Q&A. If you have any questions for our presenters, send them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And I actually want to bring us back to that first question that was asked during the presentation that was directed. Well, you responded to it for those. Someone asked, style question, AP style says to capitalize the B in Black and not the W in white. If we're moving towards the phrase Black and brown people, should we capitalize the B in brown? I know you shared a response here, but just for folks who might have missed it, if you can just respond orally right now.
Yeah, I'm happy to read it out loud and expand a little bit and invite my colleagues to jump in as well. So I said at Rethink, we don't capitalize the B in brown, and you saw that in the graphs that I shared. The B in Black was capitalized, but the B in brown was not. And there are differences of opinion on this in the public square. If you Google this, you'll see differences in what different institutions say. And so my take on it is that brown can refer to many different communities. And so it has a different meaning culturally, historically, the legacy in our country than Black does. And this is part of the call to action, I would say, is that in order for us to like really address like what is the term, how should it be formatted, more research would be helpful to understand how South Asians, Latinos, Indigenous peoples, and SWANA folks, SWANA is Southwest Asian and North African, feel about the term brown. Does capitalizing it make sense for us in public discussions?
That's great. Thank you for those. Do other people want to chime in? And no pressure. If you feel like it's, go ahead, Zeba.
One thing to geography, and keep in mind that I've just landed in New York from Honolulu last evening. When they talk about geography, they do not consider England as the center of the universe. So the Middle East is named the Middle East because England was dictating terms. It's the Middle East for England, but it's not the Middle East from the Pacific. So there's, I'm so conscious of how we're using these terms, and I just wanted to put this on the table for consideration for us all and for the future.
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks, can I just add one more thing?
Please do.
And this is actually, I think, knitting together a point that Zeba was making just a few minutes ago with a point that Firdaus made during the presentation, which is that, you know, this kind of language changes dramatically over time and is hugely influenced by the context that we're all in and using that language in. And that's one of the reasons why having updated, you know, consistently updated research is so crucial, because, for example, when we're thinking about the term Black and brown, as Firdaus mentioned, those terms were really in the zeitgeist following the racial reckoning in 2020. And we actually have no idea how resonant they are with different kinds of populations, different subsets of the American population, even now, only 2.5 years later. I mean, it's really not that long. And yet this kind of context particularly in our digital age where language changes very rapidly, and is really different for different parts of the population in terms of age, in terms of culture and language of origin, for example. All of these things are really context specific. So that's another reason why it's really important to keep the research updated and to be really specific with your research, because again, there are vast differences in how we use language, which language we prefer to talk about ourselves, to talk about other people over time and within the population.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that, Eva. We've got two questions that came in. Aaron, you responded to the first one, but I'll still say it out loud just for folks to know that it was there. Susanna asked, what video do you use in your focus group about why Muslim women choose to wear hijabs? Is the video available to others? And you responded, it is a video clip of our director of research, Dalia Mogahed, I'm not sure if I said it correctly, discussing hijab on The Daily Show. I can share the link to be sent out with follow-up material. So I said it out loud. The link will be shared. Thank you in advance. That's great. Thanks for responding to that, Aram. And we have another question that came in. It was in the chat, but it's also in our Q&A here. So if you work in a community with a majority of unpersuadables, in parentheses, we see rural community, with a growing community of, I'm going to say BAMEMSSA, but it's not, BAMEMSSA, and we broke that down earlier. Community, what's the best approach to possible pushback from a small but loud, possible pushback from small but loud unpersuadables?
I can jump in here first. And I would start by asking you a few more questions, because in the data that I shared, we did not break down the crosstabs into like urban density. So I would not make the assumption that a rural community is unpersuadable. I would look in more detail about what are the views of people there. And I say that to say, and I can share an example, there is a community in a smaller community in Vermont that was very welcoming of refugees, where the mayor instituted policies and the community was behind welcoming refugees at a time where many communities were not. So I would not make that assumption. But if you know that there is, for instance, vocal, unreachable folks who are trying to court people in the community, I think it's very important, and this is part of the work that we do, is to equip experts and spokespeople with the skills in order to do media engagement, which is a different set of communication skills than what Iram was talking a little bit about in the focus groups. Interpersonal interaction, where you talk to folks. So for instance, faith leaders who are talking to their congregation, or interfaith leaders who are working in a interreligious space. That is a different way of relating to people than for someone like Dalia to go on The Daily Show as an expert to talk to a mass audience. So I specialize in the latter, but there's very different ways that an imam, for instance, will speak to their Muslim community. And that is not from a set of talking points that you repeat in a 2-minute segment.
Anyone else want to chime in there? Okay, we've got another question in the chat, or excuse me, in the Q&A, but before I get to that, I do have a question. So as you go through your research, has there ever been a moment where some of the results of the research or the findings are very surprising to you? Neil, you mentioned something there was so much research here, so I'm I might be misremembering which number goes with what, but I'm paraphrasing, but you mentioned a particular group of Asian Americans being, based on survey data, being considered non-American and just not being, and I'm like perpetually not being considered American. That to me, that's super surprising. I don't know if that's just because of the way that I navigate the world and me being a person of color, that I'm why? But that's something that was really shocking to me. But I'm curious about some things that kind of popped up that were like, whoa, like this is interesting. And you can all kind of chime into this as well.
So one thing that popped up from our focus groups when we talked to people who lived through Japanese incarceration is that there was no data point back then to understand that Japanese Americans were really American, right? They were American and they were taking away their land, right? So we decided, we know there's geopolitics right now with China. It's getting worse over Taiwan and over the world. And so we asked this question to try to understand. People tend up doing the blame game and blame Asian Americans or Chinese Americans. So our data showed Chinese Americans in particular they actually don't like China as much. That's why they left, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is now a data point because there's policies that were being made out there. I think actually there was a famous one at MIT where they took a professor and they thought that he was being, transferring data to China, right? Well, now we have a data point. So if this gets worse, they could go to this data point and say, wait a minute, Chinese Americans actually don't like China. So that's actually what's important. That's why we wanted to ask that question based on facts, so that in the future, and this goes back to the question, what Zeba mentioned about why it's important not to it's important to trend, because we don't want to have to do research when we just go in crisis mode. Do we want to go to research when actually suddenly the government starts locking up Chinese Americans? Let's do it now so we can understand and have those data points so that the media and the narratives can be there with the actual voices of the people who are talking about.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that, Neil.
I'll add quickly that for the Latino Views project, we were expecting some discussion of allyship around like political movements or anything kind of political to come up, and it did not come up at all. Even before our focus groups, we held one-on-one interviews to kind of prep for the focus groups to see what themes might emerge, and it just didn't come back. And I don't know if it's some of us we're in this like DC bubble, and that's kind of what the talk and the rhetoric we're used to hearing, but it's so like Zeba mentioned, your geography plays even like within the US, like we're getting this broader because our sample was national. So that was really definitely something surprising that came out. And then the other thing was just sort of the effectiveness and impact of simple outreach, like a video about the 5 pillars. And for those of us who kind of grew up in the Muslim community here, and we're like, oh, there's so much new ways to do outreach, but sometimes these simple techniques, like the old school like pamphlets about what is Islam, like they still have a place. And so that definitely emerged as a finding in terms of our education and outreach efforts as well.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add on? We've got 2 minutes left and still a few questions, but there's contact information that you can always use. So if you want to add on to this right now, feel free.
If possible, I wanted to address the question around members of BIPOC communities who might be distrustful of researchers. That's very near and dear to my heart. If we're able to move on to that one.
Yeah, someone's asking, how do you overcome this? I'll read the question out loud to people in case people aren't seeing it. Do you ever find that members of BIPOC communities are understandably distrustful of researchers or surveys and are resistant to participate? How do you overcome?
Yeah, I'll go briefly, and then I want to definitely give Neil a chance to respond. But yes, definitely yes. And I think the idea is just to be really sensitive and aware about the issue. And I think this idea, it goes back to also what Firdaus was saying about this proximity to the community. So at ISPU, when we field surveys, we make sure to build into the language when talking about the survey that this is, especially if it's like 100% community. We had a survey recently that was 100% community funded and supported. So we want to explain and be very transparent about the origins of the study. Why are we doing it? What are we and what are our plans to do with the data? And that being very clear about this being by and for the community is very, very important for us. And we have found that to be somewhat effective. But and then there is going to be like subgroups within the Muslim community where you want to do some of that personal outreach. But I just wanted to definitely highlight that as an issue, but pass it to Neil for additional insight.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to have trusted messengers, or those people who are part of the community. If you're not part of the community, to be reaching out and recruiting. But also, how do we get people to answer our surveys? This is why it's expensive. You have to have money to give, you have to give incentives. So just for instance, our survey, we gave $10 to answer the survey. It works. If they see $10 coming, they'll answer the survey. So you really have to, this is why it's important, expensive, but really important work to do. And that's why we need partners to help us, and more funding. So smaller populations, harder, more incentives, more money.
Great. Anyone else before we wrap up? All right, cool. Okay, so we had one more question. It seems to have disappeared. I can't find it, but I think, oh, there we go. I'm going to read it out loud. Eva, I know you're on it. I just want to make sure people know kind of what's happening here.
Sure.
Our final question we had from Amelia. Thank you, Amelia. Thinking about the survey about how to refer to Black and Brown communities, my organization has struggled to find the right term to quickly explain the schools to the schools we work with. In the past, the schools were called underperforming, but this is belittling to the community and places blame on the students. We often settle for historically marginalized, historically underfunded, subject to systemic racism, etc. But that's a mouthful. How do you recommend finding a way to describe the communities that's accepted by or supported by the community itself, is also clear to funders, something that could be surveyed. So thank you, Eva, for taking that one on. And also, I mean, well, first thing, I think just acknowledging that language continues to change, right? Like that was said here. And I think about that all the time, like how a particular identity group will be named one thing, and then 20 years later, a new name, and 20 years later, a new name. And I think just being mindful to remember why you're doing the work you're doing, and acknowledge that the language is changing, but don't let it get in the way of what you're doing, right? But I can really appreciate that. And if you have more questions, in the slide deck that we're going to share out after this, we have the contact information, as you can see, of our presenters. So you can feel free to reach out to them, and they will be anxiously awaiting all of your questions. So I want to give an extra special thank you once again to all of our presenters, Neil, Aram, for those, Zeba, and Eva for being here with us today. Like I said, we'll send out the presentation. There'll be some additional resources as well. We're going to send out a survey that you can also see in the chat. Please let us know what you thought of the webinar. And we look forward to seeing you on our next program. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.